Thus far, life has only been in the oceans. It's time to look to land with the Bryophytes and Monilophytes. Be able to define plant, bryophyte, monilophyte, xylem, phloem, and tracheate. Be able to list and define all of the derived traits of plants. List plant clades starting here and ending with flowering plants. List the features of each plant clade. Relate plant diversity to plant phylogeny and give examples of how adaptations allowed plants to survive on land. And let's look at that land. Picture the earth before plants. It's very rocky, it's very dry. What does it smell like? Where's the food? Well, the food's back in the ocean because there's nothing growing on the land. Now, picture yourself on a plant-covered earth. Or if you can't really picture it, just go outside. What does the ground look like? Well, that soil comes from dead plant matter and broken down rocks. There's decomposition everywhere. The breakdown of rocks is going to occur by lichens, which aren't specifically plants, and we will look at those later. What does the air smell like? There's plant signals everywhere. So we can smell that whenever we cut the grass. We can smell 6-hexanol, which comes from a plant signal. There's the smell of decomposition, especially deep in the woods. And that is both fungi and the remains of plants going around. And where is the food? Well, plants aren't willing participants in being eaten. They defend themselves. There are examples where they are willing participants in. Those are called mutualisms. We're going to look at fruiting plants in a later lecture. We're going to look in class at the various costs and benefits, creating little groups of 3 with 2 costs and 2 benefits, and we'll put them on the board. I recommend you make yourself a list before we move on. Is the list we generally get in class, and probably including a few other things that students will be mentioning. On land, there are problems that are not faced in water. First off, water is pretty stable when it comes to temperature. On land, it's air, and air is not able to hold as much heat as water, so you have cold nights and hot days. Not only that, but without water, you can dry out and bake pretty quickly. There's also UV light. UV light is diffracted by water. When it hits the water, it doesn't give you cancer. Nutrients are patchy on land, whereas in water, you're surrounded in kind of a nutrient-rich broth. On land, there may be spaces where there's very low potassium or very low nitrogen. And of course, the biggest problem of land is there's a constant loss of water because you're not surrounded by water. Plants have adaptations to these land problems. First off, we have rhizoids in the mosses, which are going to be roots in later plants. And these serve as anchorage, keeping the plant anchored when the winds blow. The rhizoids, or later roots, are also going to allow nutrient and water uptakes, which prevents the problem of drying out. Pores in early mosses are going to evolve into stomata in later plants, which will regulate the loss of water through any exposed photosynthetic tissues. It also takes up CO2. There is a cuticle on all plants, and this reduces how fast plants dry out. This is a waxy layer on the outside of leaves or leaf-like things. And this is also going to block ultraviolet light to an extent. We're going to see UV light being taken up by secondary pigments as well. The hydroids of mosses are going to move water around. The xylem of larger plants is going to move water around. Leptoids in mosses are going to move sugars around, and the phloem in later plants is going to move sugar around. Let's look at these adaptations as part of a plant lifestyle. You see, algae are generally flat. I mean, there are brown algae that are able to stand up, but they're generally standing up in the water or just around the water. Also, remember that brown algae evolved in the Jurassic, so that's a lot later than plants actually evolved on land. There was a film of algae that covered the land wherever algae could survive. We see an example here where there's some snow melt and there is a rock and there's algae just basically clinging to it. So how does that algae survive on land, and how can it do better? Well, anything that can disperse spores farther is going to help these growing plants to do better. So algae evolved the ability to make its spores survive and disperse better, and those are going to be plant-based characteristics. Anything that makes plants bigger is going to be adaptive because that's going to give them more access to the sun. And anything that increases genetic diversity is, as always, going to increase the rate of evolution. So what's a plant? Easy question, hard definition. First off, all plants have what are called an alternation of generations. This is where you have a gametophyte generation, which is 1N, and a sporophyte generation, which is 2N. The sporophyte gives rise to spores. The spores give rise to gametophytes. The gametophytes give rise to gametes. The gametes fuse to make a sporophyte. This is the alternation of generations, and there is a worksheet in your lab. There are spores, of course, on the sporophyte in a multicellular sporangium. And you can see a picture of the sporangium here, and that's the spore dispersing device. These spores are covered in an organic compound called sporopollenin, which is resistant to UV, it's resistant to crushing, it's basically Kevlar for DNA. So the sporopollenin is a trait that plants have that allows the spores to survive a very long time and actually makes them fossilize really well. The sporophyte has to be multicellular, and that's easy if you have a multicellular sporangium because the sporangium is part of the sporophyte. So if the sporangium is multicellular, the sporophyte is obviously multicellular. And there's something called an apical meristem, which is where the plant is growing from, and we're going to look at those in depth later. So what did the first plants look like? Well, they were mosses. They're bryophytes. And there are these other plants here, this Cooksonia, which had rhizoids anchoring it to the ground and giving it a little water uptake. And then the sporangia at the end of these stalk-like things, you can see that they have stomata. Well, not stomata, they're pores, technically. They're technically not stomata till later on. And these plants started growing in all the moist locations where plants could survive. And as they gained adaptations, they were able to survive farther and farther away from water. We see moss in the desert now because it has evolved to live far from water. So here we have an example of the plant evolution. We can see the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts were your first plants out. And those are non-vascular plants defined as bryophytes. We can see liverworts around campus, mosses around campus and on everyone's roots. Hornworts, we're not so lucky to see those on campus. The niche is kind of taken here. But you can look at examples in your book and around our beautiful kind of moist campus. Again, these like moisture environments. Then we see club mosses, which are not true mosses, but actually have vasculature, making them vascular plants. And spikeworts and spike mosses and quillworts are also in this group called lycophytes. Some of the lycophytes actually live in the same environments as certain types of mosses. You can actually find lycophytes on campus on trees. The Monilophytes are also vascular plants made of ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns. We'll look at those later in this lecture. And then in our next lecture, we'll look at gymnosperms and angiosperms, which are defined as seed plants because they have seeds. So you can see becoming a plant was an adaptation, having vasculature was an adaptation, and having seeds is an adaptation we will look at. The bryophytes have a gametophyte dominant lifestyle. Most things that are green and moss are going to be your gametophyte. Now, sometimes you have a little bit of photosynthesis in a sporophyte, but really not enough to warrant, really looking at. Also, they're not very tall because they do not have vascular tissue. Mosses do not have seeds. Mosses do not have fruit. They are anchored to their substrate by rhizoids, not roots. So this makes them pretty short things. They can get really high up because they can live on trees, but that would evolve after the trees evolved, clearly. An example here is sphagnum moss. You can see this in boggy areas. It's, of course, living in moist areas, and it grows on top of old sphagnum. And as it decomposes, this is going to make this carbon-rich thing called peat, which is used to heat fine scotch and fine whiskey. It's also used to retain moisture in gardening. So you can actually buy sphagnum moss, which is able to retain moisture. You throw it in your garden and it's going to increase the moisture retention. Remember, a key adaptation of plants is the ability to retain moisture away from water. So you can see that being used by gardeners here in their soil. Later, water is going to give rise to vasculature. So let's look at vascular plants and what makes up vascular plants. First off, xylem and phloem. Xylem are these cells that conduct water. They are dead when they are mature. And the first ones we're going to look at are tracheae, these long cells that have pits on them. Again, we're going to look at xylem in more detail later. And tracheae are able to move water around the plant. They have lignin in their cell walls, which is a complex biomolecule that is very tough to degrade. And this gives rise to wood. So wood is xylem with lignin. Phloem, on the other hand, is conducting sugars. These cells are alive at maturity. We're going to look at vessel elements in another lecture. Dead phloem is bark as it comes out of the plant. Xylem and phloem are both found in roots, shoots, and leaves. This is actually the definition of roots, shoots, and leaves are these photosynthetic apparatus that have xylem and phloem in them that can move the water and the sugars around. Roots also serve, of course, as anchorage, keeping the plant from just blowing over. Leaves are photosynthetic and have vasculature, and we define leaves as microphylls and megaphylls. Microphylls are these little spikes off of the stem with unbranched vascular tissue. When that vascular tissue starts to branch, you give rise to megaphylls. And you can see this in this little filmy fern where we have these megaphylls forming. And we're going to see bigger leaves later on. Monilophytes and lycophytes are vascular plants with a dominant sporophyte. An easy way of remembering this is that anything that has a leaf is going to be diploid and therefore is going to be a sporophyte because xylem and phloem are sporophyte adaptations. So this is that vascular tissue reflecting back on their change in lifestyle. Monilophytes and lycophytes both have roots, shoots, and leaves. They can be pretty tall. There were once fern trees, but not true trees as we would look at them today. Those kind of went mostly extinct. The lycopods took xylem and phloem to great heights. So you can see these forests in the Carboniferous period would have these large lycopods that could reach up towards the sky that were photosynthetic. They were dominant. They branched over everything. They got the sun and they cast everything else in their shade. And of course, eventually they died and fell over. But at the time, nothing could degrade lignin, so they just sank into the swamps and formed coal. Hence, the Carboniferous period is known for the carbon we get from it, and that carbon comes through lycopods. Lycopods don't make these tall organisms anymore. Now you see lycopods on the forest floor in these little spiky things, and you can see the sporangium. Horsetails also used to be enormous. The species Calamites is found in many coal mines because it too lived in the Carboniferous and was gigantic. Now we see Equisetum arvents, the horsetail you can find around campus. It's quite a problem in people's gardens too because it has these underground stems that persist over years. So these are the horsetails. Those are actually reduced megaphylls that form their leaves. And here's an example of a fern. This is Polysticum unitum, the sword fern. They're large leaves, and they can get pretty long, up to well over 1 meter long leaves, which is big for ferns. They have true leaves, they have true roots, and they reproduce by spores. You can find these spores on the underside of the leaves. And this is a good plant to actually put in your garden. They're very hardy, they're deer resistant, they're drought resistant, they're pretty hard to kill, which makes it a great garden plant. I've got some pretty close to where I'm filming this right now. This is for your lab. You can see these plant groups and adaptations. Put these in your own words and look at your lab notebook, and you're going to see that you can add these and maybe even get a little extra credit on that. We're going to compare the seed plants later on. And in class, we're going to look at an example of the Carboniferous forest. This is a pretty good link. Check out the PowerPoint and watch that YouTube video. It's kind of fun.